Good morning, Munchkins. Dad is back, but first, a word from your sponsor. If you like what you hear, hit the share button. If you love what you hear, please smash that subscribe button. It's free and allows me to do a lot more of these. Okay, as they say in boxing, let's get it on. History doesn't repeat itself, it just rhymes. So that's a famous saying from Mark Twain. And as I walk through this, you'll begin to see why. So back in the late 80s, I was an officer in the U.S. Air Force. While in the Air Force, I established friendships with a number of black Air Force officers. I was the youngest member of this group. Most of them were captains, while I was just a lieutenant, fresh out of officer school. These men were all highly intelligent, educated, sophisticated, and articulate. A number of them had graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy, and I was in close communication with a number of them when O.J. Simpson was tried for the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Of course, the O.J. Simpson trial was the topic that everybody was talking about back then. And those discussions provided me with a profound education on human nature, and not only on the capacity to reason, but on the will to reason itself. The evidence that O.J. Simpson was guilty of this double homicide was overwhelming. In spite of this, every single one of my black friends were convinced that O.J. Simpson should be found not guilty. Now note, I didn't say that they said he was not guilty. I said that they said he should be found not guilty no matter the evidence. I was completely dumbfounded that this group of highly educated blacks essentially told me that the evidence didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that O.J. should be found not guilty to get back at Whitey for the historical wrongs that were done against blacks. When I challenged them on the adverse consequences of weaponizing the judicial system to punish one group for the historic sins of another, I was mocked out of the room. I have a few moments in my life where my faith in humanity has been so utterly crushed. I mean, moments when I had to reflect on my belief in my fellow man, moments when I had to reflect on my belief in my core principles, moments where I questioned everything that I had been raised to believe. That was one of those moments. When my highly educated, articulate, and erudite black friends were perfectly willing to set fire to the rule of law and the judicial system in exchange for feeling good about getting back at Whitey, my breath was just taken away. To get back at Whitey thought process would not have surprised me one bit with what you might call the uneducated black underclass. But to hear from what W.E.B. Du Bois would have called the talented 10th, now that was shocking. But there it was right in front of me. Maybe the biggest lesson learned from that episode was that when human beings reach a place of unreason, objective evidence simply doesn't matter. When feelings replace reason, no amount of reasoning can break through. It's just time to get the pitchforks and the torches, baby. Now that's a great time to segue into the current Karmelo Anthony case. To quote Yogi Berra, it's deja vu all over again. While the evidence was overwhelming in the O.J. Simpson case that he was guilty, there were no eyewitnesses. One could make an argument for reasonable doubt. The Karmelo Anthony case was different from the O.J. case in that there were plenty of eyewitnesses. Unlike in the O.J. case, it is beyond dispute that Karmelo Anthony killed Austin Metcalf. As with the O.J. Simpson case, the purpose of this rant is not to relitigate the trial. The purpose of this rant is to discuss the following question. Quote, how do we as a society reach a point where we have whole segments of our population who are willing to suspend reason? As we've seen in the media, there are huge swaths of the black population who share the same thinking as my old U.S. Air Force friends on the O.J. case. These people think that Karmelo Anthony should be found innocent because he is black. His actual innocence or guilt is irrelevant to these people. How do we as a society produce segments of our society who do not care one bit about the evidence in a case? How do we as a society produce segments of our society who are willing to determine innocence or guilt based on the skin color of the victim and the skin color of the assailant? How do we reach a point where huge segments of our society are unable to see the danger in situational justice? How did our society produce a kid who would carry a knife to a high school track meet? How did our society produce a kid who would think an appropriate reaction to being asked to leave would be to plunge a knife into the chest of another teenager? It's been barely 60 years since Reverend Martin Luther King dreamed of a day when a man would be judged not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. Is MLK now passé? Are his principles passé? Of course, your old dad has some thoughts to share, and of course I'm going to share them. As usual, if these thoughts make sense, use them. If they don't make sense, discard them. I'll bring as much evidence-based reasoning and history to this rant as I can possibly muster. Time for a quick sip. All right, let's get into it. You must first recognize that there's a well-built incentive to keep racial strife alive. And the salesmen for this industry I'll call race hustlers. Note this quote from Booker T. Washington, and he gave this quote in 1911. Quote, "There's a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy, and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs." Now, Mr. Washington said that clear back in 1911. There are three primary weapons in the race hustler's armamentarium. There is the psychological grift, the financial grift, and the vote-buying grift. Let me discuss each of these in turn. The psychological grift works by creating unearned emotional capital that is then placed in the psychological asset column for blacks. This emotional capital is deducted from the psychological liability column for whites. The objective of the psychological grifter is to infuse every interaction between blacks and whites with this emotional capital. In practice, what this means is that whites aren't allowed to discuss issues involving race with blacks. If whites are allowed in the discussion at all, their discussions are discounted because of the color of their skin. The psychological grift assumes that the black person is correct and the white person is incorrect, regardless of the content of the idea. This grift is so effective that liberal and conservative whites buy into it before the conversation even begins. The psychological grift puts the white interlocutor on the defense before any discussion can take place. And as you guys know from sports, you can't win the game unless you can score points. You have to play offense at some point if you're going to win the game. If you're always playing defense, you're always on the back foot. That, of course, is the objective of the individual with whom you are debating. Whenever you observe a conversation that begins with a person saying, "As a," insert race or gender, "I believe XYZ," you can be sure that the person is using the psychological grift. Rather than rely on the weight of the evidence, they are seeking to use race as an advantage to load emotional capital into their psychological asset column and emotional liability into the psychological liability column of their adversary. That's grift number one. The second grift is a financial grift. There are entire organizations whose sole existence is to benefit financially from the racial strife. Many of these organizations were founded at a time when discrimination was very real and the objectives of the organizations were noble and necessary. A prime example of this is the NAACP. The NAACP was founded in 1909. By the early 20s, KKK membership peaked at around 4 million members. As a result of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, separate but equal was the law of the land. Being black in America at that time was demonstrably more difficult than it was for any other group. The Democrat Party had passed numerous laws to prevent blacks from participating in public life. They passed poll taxes and grandfather laws to prevent blacks from voting. They passed public accommodation laws to prevent blacks from being able to access hotels and restaurants. Democrat politicians passed these anti-black laws. The informal enforcement arm of the Democrat Party was the KKK. For blacks who didn't get the message from the legal system, the KKK stood ready to enforce Democrat law with a shadow police force called the KKK. Their instruments of power didn't need the jail. Lynchings and cross burnings kept any antsy blacks in line. The actions of the NAACP were instrumental in delivering Brown versus the Board of Education decision in 1954, which made separate but equal illegal and overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. The original objectives of the NAACP were to secure the constitutional rights guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which included the abolition of slavery, equal protection under the law, and the voting rights for all men. The organization sought to eliminate racism in housing, education, employment, and transportation. It is undeniable that these goals were largely achieved by the early 90s. There are no more whites-only water fountains, restaurants, hotels, or trains. There are plenty of blacks who hold prominent positions in large corporations. There are plenty of blacks who hold political offices, to include recently the presidency. The KKK has been reduced to a historical footnote. There are no more lynchings, water hoses, or German shepherds turned loose on black protesters. Democrat governors no longer stand at the schoolhouse door to prevent blacks from going to school. So by the early 90s, the organization was faced with a problem. The organization faced the problem of being a victim of its own success. Racial discrimination was pretty much eradicated by the 90s. But since the purpose of the organization was the elimination of racial discrimination, the elimination of discrimination meant the elimination of the organization itself. I'm talking about the NAACP now. So solving the problem of discrimination meant ending the cash flow. The original founders of the NAACP had died or moved on now that the mission was accomplished. As the mission neared accomplishment and the organization grew, it inevitably gained people who weren't in it to solve the original problem, but were in it for the grift. My guess is that by the early 90s, the organization was top-heavy with grifters. So as your mom and I learned in Marketing 101, create a problem and provide the solution, this is the strategy currently employed by organizations like the NAACP. That's the financial grift. Market the problem like it still exists and keep the cash flowing. The gullible and intellectually lazy will continue to send cash, but there are others who benefit from the grift besides the gullible and the intellectually lazy. This is a great segue to discuss the final grift. Grift number 3, and the final grift, is the vote-buying grift. The Democrat Party has sold huge swaths of the black population on the idea that the black problems are due to racism and have nothing to do with behavior. And the only way to solve the race problem is to vote for Democrats, who promise to fix the problem. This strategy has been a sensational success for the Democratic Party, as somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of the black vote has historically gone to Democrats over the past 60 years. And this continues in spite of the fact that the problems the NAACP targeted to resolve 100 years ago have largely been resolved. A little bit of history is in order. It became apparent by the mid-60s that the Democrat strategy of preventing blacks from participating in society was no longer a viable strategy. This is the mid-60s. It turned out that turning water hoses and German shepherds loose on black citizens really looked bad on the international stage. After all, it's hard to beat up on Cuba's Fidel Castro for his human rights abuses at the United Nations when the TV screen is filled with Democrat governors turning German shepherds loose on blacks to keep them from attending school or even getting a drink of water. When the Voting Rights Act came along in 1965, the main opposition came from the Democratic Party. When the party of LBJ saw that the VRA, Voting Rights Act, would pass over their opposition, they simply shifted strategy. LBJ launched the War on Poverty program. The stated intention of the program was to assist poor blacks. But let me quote President Johnson's own words on the true intention of the program. And I quote, "I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 100 years." That was President Johnson circa 1965. Now, there's some controversy around whether he actually used those words, although any study of other things LBJ said would cause any rational person to come to the conclusion that, apocryphal or not, the intention was real. In an earlier rant, I warned you about maskirovka. That is the strategy of deception. This is the strategy of telling you that they are operating for your benefit when in fact they are operating for your demise. Or put another way, the strategy of masking their true objective. The war on poverty is a prime example of maskirovka. To know the true objective, you have to look at the results of what the left delivers. Forget about what they say, because what they say is always maskirovka. So what are the results of 60 years of the war on poverty? A black underclass completely dependent on the government. A black underclass where dads are nowhere to be found. A black illegitimacy rate exceeding 70 to 80% in most urban areas. Urban public school systems that resemble prisons, and since that's where its graduates wind up, maybe it's the liberal undergraduate program for blacks, prisons being graduate school. An urban violence problem so bad that I have friends from Chicago who tell me they literally would not allow their wives to go with them when they go home to visit. It's that bad. And finally, blacks voting Democrat at the presidential level in the 90% plus range. Now that last thing I just said, that's the true objective of LBJ, and it has delivered on that issue big time. I don't care how bad the candidate is. If the candidate is Democrat, blacks will vote for that candidate sight unseen. And that, kiddos, is the vote-buying grift. To illustrate how it works, let me give you a true personal story from one of your grandmother's cousins. Your grandmother's cousin, Jay, I'll call him, told me that immediately following the Watts riots in 1965, the Democrat Party sent grifters door to door in their neighborhood with the goal of signing up blacks for welfare. He said that he and his brothers ran them out of the neighborhood. Back in those days, it was considered shameful to accept welfare. The black culture at that time period considered welfare a last resort. 1 second here. Thank you. Of course, we all know that the welfare check did to what the welfare check did to the black families in the mid-60s. It drove black illegitimacy rate to go from roughly 15% to now over 80%. And it accomplished LBJ's goal. It created the black underclass completely dependent on the government for handouts. This dependency caused them to vote for their slave master who controls their paycheck. And that new slave master is the government. LBJ's goal was to have blacks voting Democrat for the next 100 years. We're 60 years into LBJ's grift, and so far it's been highly effective. Blacks vote for their own destruction at astonishing rates. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 85% of blacks in every election vote for Democrats. Okay, let's tie this all back to our question of the day. How do we reach a place where a huge subset of the population is willing to upend the judicial system and replace it with a situational justice system? How do we as a society reach a point where we have segments of our population who are willing to suspend reason? My answer to that question lies in the following three categories. You have the psychological grift, which prevents non-blacks from entering into the discussion. How can you solve a problem that you can't even discuss? You have the financial grift, which incentivizes large organizations to create a problem that no longer exists. How can you solve a problem that's already been solved? This also takes time away from discussing the very real and current problem, the destruction of the black family. Finally, you have the vote-buying grift. The very existence of the Democratic Party rests on its ability to keep blacks on the handout plantation. Any messaging that would imply that blacks have any control over their own destiny is anathema to the objectives of the Democratic Party. The party must have that vote to stay in power. The handout's the answer. These three grifts work together to create Karmelo Anthony's. The psychological grift creates Karmelo Anthony's with its messaging that my shortcomings in life are all due to Whitey. The financial grift creates Karmelo Anthony's with its built-in incentive structure to continue to finance civil rights organizations to solve a problem that no longer exists. The vote-buying grift creates Karmelo Anthony's by funding the continued destruction of the black family and creating a dependency mentality that keeps them voting Democrat. This has proven to be a highly effective strategy. One obvious question that I have not addressed in this rant is this. Where are the black voices that disagree with the grift? Not every black person buys into these three grifts. This will have to be addressed in the future rant. Let's stuff that one into the parking lot. After all, old dad is in fact old and tired of writing and speaking and in need of my morning round of orange juice with maybe a little bit of something mixed in. Run all that through your noodle. Ask the most important question of all. Does that make sense? And we'll discuss that at our next rap session. Until then, ciao and peace out.